Isaiah 20 and 21 is very interesting because it warns us against putting hope in false things,
Okay.
like relying on earthly things to put our hope in. And it brought to mind my grandmother, who, as my husband goes, of course it does, she's been dead 30 years and never stopped talking. Well, she always had these things to tell me that as I get older, I realize how wise a woman she was. And she told me once that we should never store up or put hope in things on earth. We should only collect things that are eternal. And that the most important eternal thing we could store up was love. And I think that's part of what Isaiah is saying here, is that we have put our hope in earthly things, in earthly kings, in earthly countries, in earthly possessions, and that we should turn back to what is eternal, which is God, that God is our only true hope. So, Jeff, how about if you read Isaiah 1 through 6, 21 through 6.
All right, you have to wait a minute till I find it.
Okay.
And Angie, I'll be ready to read the second passage when you get to it.
Thanks.
All right, chapter 21 through 6, which looks like it might be the whole chapter. In the year when the commander-in-chief, who was sent by King Sargon of Assyria, came to Ashdod and fought against it and took it. At that time, the Lord had spoken to Isaiah, son of Amoz, saying, "Go and loose the sackcloth from your loins and take the sandals off your feet." And he had done so, walking naked and barefoot. Then the Lord said, "Just as my servant Isaiah has walked naked and barefoot for 3 years as a sign and a portent against Egypt and Ethiopia, so shall the king of Assyria lead away the Egyptians as captives and the Ethiopians as exiles, both the young and the old, naked and barefoot, but with buttocks uncovered, to the shame of Egypt. So they shall be dismayed and confounded because of Ethiopia, their hope, and of Egypt, their boast. In that day, the inhabitants of the coastland will say, 'See, this is what has happened to those in whom we hoped and to whom we fled for help and deliverance from the king of Assyria. And we, how shall we escape?'"
So, God commanded Isaiah to take his clothes off and walk around. Now, most of the commentaries explain to me that he wasn't totally naked, that he probably still had on his undergarments, which would cover, it was kind of like a loincloth type of thing. So, but he didn't have shoes on, and to walk around like that was both embarrassing and humiliating back in those times. The very, very poor,
Probably hold true today.
So probably Jeff says that would probably hold true today.
Yeah.
If you had 2 cents to rub together, you bought yourself a cloak of some kind. And to not even have enough to have a cloak to wrap around you was shameful. So he, God has commanded him, take it all off. And there were several commentaries about what it meant for Isaiah to walk around naked. Any thoughts on your part? Why would God command one of his prophets to humiliate himself in public?
No, because it says he did it for that Isaiah did it for 3 years
3 years.
as a sign and omen against Egypt and Ethiopia. Okay. That's,
So,
that kind of thing goes over my head. I'm like, what? I don't, because, and then as it talks on, but anyhow.
okay, think about humiliating, shameful, embarrassing as a sign against Egypt and Ethiopia. Who had Israel turned to save them? Egypt and Ethiopia. They had turned to them to say, protect us, keep us safe from invaders, the Assyrians, and instead they were humiliated. All hope was lost. And this is an omen of what's to come. God is saying, if you put your hope in earthly things rather than your hope in me, this is what's going to happen to you. It's that continuation of the story of Isaiah of turn back, turn back, turn back to God, turn back to that which is eternal. Stop putting your hope in things in the earth, things of the earth, powers of the earth. How do you think that can relate to us today? And what's going on in our country? We're getting ready to come up on an election year.
Oh, yeah. So rethinking our priorities and what's really important and putting that into practice.
I remember back in the election of 2016, I guess it was, when people were so divided over who they were going to vote for. And the person I hoped would be elected was not elected. And the people, a lot of people were very angry and outspoken about who got elected. And Jeff and I talked about it. And the answer came to us that, did God change from yesterday to today? President changed, but God didn't change. And if we put our hope there and kept our eyes on what he wanted for us, we were going to be okay. And I think sometimes one of the things that we forget in today's world is we look at all the circumstances around us and we forget who is watching over us. What do y'all think? And
I'm thinking about how hard it is, how easy it is, rather, to lose sight of what is eternal.
Oh, yes.
Like you were saying when you first started, Angie, with the lesson about your grandmother and about the things you hold on to are the things that are eternal. The things you work to keep are the things that are eternal.
It was interesting. It brought back into my mind also as I was doing this lesson, my mother had Alzheimer's. And as time went on, she lost her memory of who we were. Okay. I made her a scrapbook of pictures of us as children. All the way up to today, my brother, sister, and I. And she loved to sit and look at the scrapbook when we were little. And she would tell me stories I'd never heard before about when we were little. She could recall all our childhood and tell me stories about it. I came in one day And she was looking at, at school, as a school teacher, I got my picture taken every year on picture day. And I had a picture in there of my most recent school picture. And the scrapbook was open on her lap and she was rubbing the picture.
Mm.
And she looked at me distressed. And she said, I don't remember who this person is.
Oh.
And something in her, she knew enough to know I should probably know who this person is.
Uh-huh.
And then her face cleared and she said, I do remember I loved her very much.
So what was eternal?
So I guess I understood then that my grandmother meant the only thing we take with us is that which is eternal. She didn't remember my name, but she did remember she loved me. And I was satisfied with that.
Uh-huh. Oh.
And
Well,
as I read this, I thought about that whole story of, are we satisfied with God being enough? Enough so that we're willing to do what God commands, even if it's humiliating. And I thought about the many times I felt compelled to speak out in a crowd about Jesus and hadn't. Why?
Mhm.
Was I embarrassed, afraid, thinking that people would look at me funny? And
Mhm.
it made me, this whole thing of Isaiah made me think a great deal about what is it that God was trying to tell the people of Israel, and what is he trying to tell us still today?
you're really pointing out or asking some very important questions that I don't know that I've ever stopped and asked myself.
Mm.
Very
When
interesting.
we lived in Georgia, there's a guy that writes a financial column with the Atlanta newspaper. And he was in it like every other week or something like that. And his focus was always on retirement and happiness. He was always trying to study and find the connection between retirement and happiness. And he had surveyed a lot of his clients. And as he said, it wasn't a study that, would hold up clinically because, it was not a random sample or anything like that. It was his clients. But he was looking for all kinds of connections and he wrote books. I mean, he got into the weeds of what types of car do you buy versus happiness and that kind of stuff. But one of the things he talked about, he had, I want to say about 5 to 7 traits that his happiest customers were. And he said one of them was they had some kind of faith. They were involved in some kind of faith. He goes, I found the ones that were putting their faith in a sports team or whatever. He said, when the season's over or when the weekend's done or whatever, they've got nothing and they're not happy. But those that have faith in a higher being of some sort, he didn't try to distinguish between Christianity and Judaism and Islam and anything else. But he said, those that were putting their focus there tended to be happier people than those that were looking to whatever it might be. We can politicians, political parties, sports teams, having the right car or the right doodad or whatever. He said if the focus was there, the happiness generally wasn't. And that kind of goes back to, I always think what Angie's grandmother was talking about. It's like you got to look for something more eternal.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought it was interesting that when the Assyrians came in and overtook Egypt, they were surprised at how weak Egypt was. Egypt was living on its past glories,
Mm-hmm.
not thinking to the future, not trusting in, you know, we were strong enough then, we're invincible. This idea of belief in ourselves as being able to carry us through anything. Egypt's belief in its own strength was what finally defeated her, which then of course took me back to history classes I used to have, where, you know, the biggest thing we learned was that Rome fell from internal decay. You know, they were ripe for the picking when everyone came in to overtake it, because it was slowly but surely rotting from the inside. And I thought about, what do we need to do as a people to keep ourselves strong? What are, as Jeff was saying, what are the things we need to, what is the foundation upon which we need to build our life? It has, in my mind, it has to start, you build this foundation on God and you build from there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He's ever present. And you build from there instead of relying on, as he said, a sports team or a certain type of car, or, you know, even relying on other people, because like it or not, people are going to disappoint you. You know, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally.
Right.
I thought it was interesting that Babylon was called a wilderness by the sea. Many of the commentaries talked about that, about it being a wilderness by the sea, and it talked about the violent desert storms they have in that area. Violent desert storms with winds reaching hurricane speeds and whipping the sand and tearing things apart and taking it out over the water, and there being tremendous amount of flooding. And it talked about, in the future, from Isaiah's perspective, Babylon will rise up under King Nebuchadnezzar to become the great superpower of the ancient world. But what the prophecy focuses on was how transitory even Babylon was.
Mm-hmm.
Like those violent and destructive storms in the Negev, so shall the conquerors storm across Babylon. And that's a reference to the initial conquest of Babylon by the Medes and the Persians under Cyrus, that began in 539 and eventually brought Babylon to ruin.
Mm-hmm.
So would you read the rest of 20 and the first few verses, like up through verse 5 and 21?
I read all of 20.
Oh, you read all of 20?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, we did 1 through
Would you-
6.
All right, 21.
All right.
Chapter 21.
Chapter 21.
Yes.
All right. And this morning I'm reading from the Common English Bible. All right. So all of 21 through verse 16, 1 through 16. Okay. An oracle about the wilderness near the sea. So this is Babylon that they're talking about. Like
Yes.
whirlwinds sweeping through the arid southern plain, it comes from the desert, from a fearsome land. A harsh vision was proclaimed to me. The betrayers betray, the betrayer betrays, and the destroyer destroys. Go up, Elam, lay siege, Medea. put an end to all her groaning. Therefore, I'm shaken to my core in anguish. Pains have seized me like the pains of a woman in labor. I'm too bent over to hear, too dismayed to see. My heart pounds, convulsions overpower me. He has turned my evening of pleasure into dread, setting the table, spreading the cloth, eating, drinking. Arise, captains, polish the shields. The Lord said this to me. Go, post a lookout to report what he sees. When he sees chariots, pairs of horsemen, donkey riders, camel riders, he should listen carefully, carefully, very carefully. Then the seer called out, upon a watchtower, Lord, I'm standing all day, and upon my observation post, I'm stationed throughout the night. Here they come, charioteers, pairs of horsemen. One spoke up and said, fallen, fallen is Babylon, and all the images of her gods are shattered on the ground. Oh, my downtrodden people, threshed on my threshing floor, what I heard from the Lord of heavenly forces, the God of Israel, I reported to you. An oracle about Duma. Someone is calling to me from Seir. Guard, how long is the night? Guard, how long is the night? The guard said, morning has come, but it is still night. If you must inquire, inquire. Come back again. An oracle about the desert. In the woods, in the desert where you camp, caravans of the Dedanites meet the thirsty with water. Inhabitants of the land of Tema greet the refugees with bread. They have fled from swords, from the drawn sword, from the bent bow, and from the intensity of battle. So the Lord said to me, within a year, according to the number of years for which a laborer is hired, all the glory of Kedar will end. There will be few Kedarite archers remaining. The Lord God of Israel has spoken.
Okay. We talked about Babylon being under King Nebuchadnezzar, and that happened in fell in 539 BC. And that conquest by the Medes and the Persians set in motion the process that eventually brought Babylon to become a perpetual desert. It literally became a howling wilderness. The Roman historian Strabo, 60 BC, the great city has become a desert. So Isaiah, all those years ago, wrote about 539 BC, wrote about it becoming a desert. And in 60 BC, Strabo, the Roman historian, wrote, the city became a desert. So a prophecy that came true. And from Mount Seir comes the question, watchman, when will the long night of Assyrian oppression be over?
Mm-hmm.
And the answer was, morning is coming.
Mm-hmm.
Morning is coming. So when is our oppression going to be over? Morning is coming. In the future, the oppression will be over. And it says that, but night will come again too.
Mm-hmm.
And it talks about the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans. And it says, the watchman goes on to say, if you want to inquire, do so. Turn and come. That's verse 12b and 21.
Mm-hmm.
The watchman invites Edom to inquire further, to look to the prophet of God and the word of God for true and lasting answers, Edom is exhorted to turn and come, repent and come to the Lord, and gain a place in the new creation. And then the trading caravans of the Dedanites are instructed to seek shelter in the Arabian forest because the Assyrian army are there. The caravan routes have become unsafe. Isaiah 21:13 says that. But what does the Lord warn will happen to the whole land of Kedar, which is Arabia?
Oh, Kedar is Arabia. Oh, okay.
Look at Isaiah 21:16 and 17. Who can read those two? Do you mind doing it again?
No, I've got it.
Okay.
So the Lord
16 and
said, yeah, 16 and 17.
Yes.
So the Lord said to me, within a year, according to the number of years for which a labor is hired, all the glory of Kedar will end. There will be few Kedarite archers remaining. The Lord God of Israel has spoken.
Okay. Morning is coming, but we've got to go through night also.
Through the night. Yeah, it's still night. Says that all of the inhabitants of Kedar, which is Arabia, will be conquered by the invading Assyrians, and this has been determined by God. The Lord is warning that there is no truly safe place of refuge in the world, no place that is invulnerable to tribulation or calamity. The only true refuge is the Lord himself. Turn and come to me. Mm.
And he says it, turn and come to me. Don't rely on Egypt. Don't rely on Ethiopia. Don't rely on Arabians. Don't rely, he goes on and on and on saying, don't rely on these things.
Right, because back in chapter 20, the Egyptians and the Ethiopians, while Isaiah might have had a loincloth on, 20 says they're walking around with their buttocks bared. So,
Yeah, exactly. I mean, turn and come to me. He keeps saying, turn from the path you're taking. In other words, we're not headed in the right direction. And I think about, we were traveling over the holidays, how many times my GPS would say, rerouting, and show the little U-turn thing where we had taken the wrong road. And
you hear that little
it
beep,
was
you're like,
telling
oops.
us back on track. If you continue this way, you're gonna be lost.
We need a spiritual GPS.
Yes,
Yeah.
we need a spiritual GPS.
Here we are. Here we are. Yeah.
Yep. So I think that Isaiah is saying, you put your faith in human things, in human cultural things, in humanity, and turn around and go in another direction. Turn and come back to me. It's part of that, the whole Isaiah warning them that you've gone too far. You think that the Egyptians were strong. They weren't. They relied on their past glory. You thought the Ethiopians were going to do it. They weren't. You thought the Babylonians were going to be there to save you. Well, they had huge storms, howling winds, and eventually Babylon was turned into a virtual desert. So you've been relying on all the wrong things. And I go back again to this idea of walking around naked. Literally, you're exposed,
Mm-hmm.
but figuratively, you're also exposed. We're
Mm-hmm.
spiritually exposed.
Mm-hmm.
And if we want to look at walking around naked being, we have nothing we can rely on. Turn and go back to the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
Any thoughts on Isaiah 20 and 21?
So going back to 20, where Isaiah was walking around for 3 years, basically naked, and thus making himself terribly vulnerable, vulnerable to God. So it's
And allowing himself to be made fun of by everyone,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
but
Yeah.
still following what God told him to do. Take your clothes off and walk around because I've commanded you to do so. I often think, how often does God ask me to do something and I go, Jeff loves the Old Testament prophets because they always have an excuse for not doing something. And that's like Moses, Lord, I'm not doing that because I stutter. And Jonah going, Lord, I'm not doing that. I'd rather be swallowed by a big fish. Lord, we go on and on and on. God asks us to do something and we turn him down. It's not in our comfort zone.
But when I finally resigned myself, I do make the comment before I get swallowed by a fish or before I, come home one night and see an azalea burning in my front yard, or it's not going anywhere. I think I might as well do this.
Right. How often do we make ourselves vulnerable to God? Yeah. Yeah, like Isaiah did. When was the last time? I'm thinking, when was the last time I did that with God, to make myself vulnerable, to sit back and really try to listen to what he wants me to do.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot too this week about stopping and taking time during my prayer time to shut up. To not be assaulting God's ears as much with what I want and what I need. I always start my prayer time by praising him, but I sometimes wonder if I'm doing that because I know a whole lot of wants and needs are coming up. And so let me start out, like a teacher. Let me start out telling you what you did well, and now let me get to the part I really need.
Well, yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say too, I think for myself, I'm like, I've been around for 68 years, I've done a lot of this stuff before. Yeah, I know what to do. And so, stepping back and, that I still have a lot to learn. There's still a lot to learn.
It's been interesting with our grandchild. There was a very acrimonious split between her birth mom and her partner. And she took it all out on Harper, and Harper internalized it all and became very angry.
Mhm.
And she didn't ever want to see her again, that woman. She didn't want to ever have to visit her again. She didn't ever, ever, ever. You know, it was like there was, and it made me sad because she was responding towards her the way the woman had responded to her. You know, I'm angry with you, so I'm going to take my anger out here. She at least was taking her anger out at the right person, but nevertheless, I wanted her to get past the anger. Over Christmas, this woman's house burned down.
Oh my. Oh,
Everything. And Harper's comment when she told me was, I want to do something for her. I may not like her, but I feel sympathy for her.
wow.
And I thought, wow, we've come a long way here.
Yeah.
From, I don't even want to talk about her, I hate her, to, I want to do something for her. I feel sympathy for her.
Mhm.
I think that we forget that God can do the impossible
Mhm. Mhm.
by changing our hearts.
Mhm.
It's not necessarily that he's going to come down and do some, you know, set the wet wood on fire or something like that, but rather he's going to do a more difficult miracle, which is change my heart.
Mhm.
And that's what Isaiah, I think, was telling the people of Israel. You got to change your hearts.
Mhm.
Heart and turn back, turn back, turn back. You're on the wrong path.
And
That's
is there,
I really,
looking back at 21, the guard was saying, the morning is coming, but it's still night.
yes,
So it's like, if you must inquire, inquire, come back again. So maybe it's like, you need to deal with the fact that it's still night. You know, you can't just wait
exactly.
till day. You still got to deal with it being night.
Mhm. You have to learn to walk through the darkness. And
Uh-huh.
sometimes around, we've got to go back through a lot of mess we left in our wake
Uh-huh. Yeah.
before you get out of that to return to God.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Yeah.
I really liked my crazy prophet chapters. And it's interesting to think so much about it. It kept popping up in my head. Things would happen and I would think, turn back, turn back. Or am I willing to be that vulnerable?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
How much do I put up to protect myself? And I think we all do that.
You know, it's interesting. I I follow this one lady on YouTube, and she is a very faithful individual. And throughout her life, at various times, she said she's heard a voice telling her to do something, and it usually has very much been on the money. And she said she's doing some kind of random task. I don't know. I can't remember what it was, but she said she heard that same voice say, "A shift is coming." And I thought that she said the last time she heard a voice was about 4 years ago when it told her that they needed to move, which she did. But have y'all picked up on anything that there may be a major shift or change coming in the near future?
Sometimes it seems like with each major crisis that comes up, I wonder if that's the beginning of a shift. Oh.
Mhm.
You know, like with the
I
war in Israel and Gaza right now, and the war in Ukraine, and but she doesn't know what the shift is. She just
Yeah, she's just heard the same voice that she has heard throughout her life said a shift is coming. And you know, the war in Gaza, you know, when the Gazans attacked Israel, that did not surprise me because that has occurred repeatedly ad nauseum. What really surprised me was the global anti-Semitic sentiment that immediately roared out of the darkness. I found that rather alarming.
I agree with you, Nancy. I think that is so alarming. I think I have spoken before about having Jewish weaver friends,
Mhm.
and each week, at least one of the women will make a comment about some experience that she has had this week that's, you know, scared her or afraid. We have one woman that just literally won't leave the house without her husband. She is so afraid. And I think what a horrible way for us to be. I just don't understand why. I just don't understand.
Hmm.
Well, my hope lies in the Lord is one of my favorite verses. And I find myself turning more and more often to prayer, which is my conversation with God. And I find myself not necessarily doing it like, okay, it's prayer time, I'm gonna clear my mind, but I'm having a conversation with God in the car. I'm having a conversation with God at the grocery store. I'm having a conversation with God. And maybe for the first time, I'm beginning to understand what it means to pray without ceasing. It
Mm.
doesn't mean to stop life. It just means include him in everything in my life.
Mhm.
You know, that was always my favorite part of Fiddler on the Roof was Tevye would have a running conversation with God throughout the entire movie. He was always talking to God no matter what happened.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Hmm. Wow. Well, this has been a thought-provoking morning, that's for sure.